Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today we're going to answer a little bit of a question. We were polling some of our audience, asking what sorts of topics they would like to see, and one of them that seemed to be popular with people was, what is the best jurisdiction for crypto business owners, or rather, what is the best residency for crypto business owners? We're going to talk about that subject today. Before we do that, if you haven't already, if you would really mind hitting the subscribe button, I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much for your support. We appreciate it. And if you'd like help with the subjects we deal with here, which are international tax optimization, asset protection, forming companies, opening bank accounts, getting residencies, citizenships, etc., please reach out to me. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or send a message to our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. Okay, so when we say crypto business owners, it's worth separating out different types of crypto business owners, right? So there's a difference between the person who is putting assets into a business to do trading or yield farming or lending or staking or something like that. It's kind of a holding investment company model versus somebody who is building a business which is going to service crypto projects. So this might be, a blockchain development company or something like that. Which is different still with something like actually launching a project, okay? So I've previously done a video and mentioned that if you're gonna launch a token, the typical structure that we would do today would involve something like a Panama Foundation as the issuing entity, and then you might have another legal entity which contracts to it, which provides the development services, right? That would be an example. Maybe it's going to also provide the marketing services. Maybe you separate out the marketing because of different risks, etc. But that's kind of the way to go. That's for the structure. Now, it's not for the residency, right? If we're talking about, where are you going to set up a structure for actually, doing trading or something? I mean, it gets a little bit more complicated because you're located typically where you're resident, which brings us to this question of where should you be resident for this type of business. And in some cases, you can just hold straight. So let's just start by saying, okay, you could realistically, from a tax standpoint, any zero tax jurisdiction is pretty good. Most places where, if you're doing trading, okay, most places that aren't zero tax are going to be a bit of an issue. Yeah, you get something weird in France of all places because France is, normally terrible for tax on every other way. Cyprus is good in the sense that they don't tax the sale of securities, and we can generally view crypto at this point as sale of securities. There's sometimes people would make an argument about, active versus passive, although technically in the law it doesn't separate that, and so it's generally a good place for traders in general, okay? On the other hand, if you're going to set up a business, it's usually not so great because you're kind of stuck in this 12.5% tax regime in most cases. It's not necessarily great for banking, not necessarily good for the management and control rules for companies abroad. It's not necessarily good for a bunch of these things, okay? On the other hand, if you're actually going to look at another alternative, you could go with someplace like UAE, right? So UAE is great because it's zero tax, right? You could go to, let's just kind of quickly ask, you could look at some place like Monaco, zero tax, right? Problem is, it's not very modern in its approach, and it's not as easy to become resident there. You could go to one of the Caribbean islands, not as good for networking, and frankly, the networking is fairly important in most of these, so that's usually not as good. However, Americans certainly, there's a good ecosystem in Puerto Rico. I was just talking to an investor today who was inviting me to go down and go for a visit. I haven't been to Puerto Rico in quite a long time, so may do that in the new year. Could be a nice visit. And, so you've got a few of those options. What else do you have as possible considerations? Well, you could look at places like Singapore, right? Not amazing in the sense that it's not zero tax by any stretch, but on the other hand, it's a pretty crypto-friendly part of the world. Capital gains aren't taxed, etc. Right? So you could do that. And certainly, if what you're doing is long-term buy and holds, then that's a great environment. So I would say if you're doing long-term buy and holds, and that's your kind of residency thing, then usually what would be the places you would look? You'd look at Singapore, you would look at Malaysia, both for the fact that they don't have capital gains tax, possibly Hong Kong if you were going to do that. You could look at Dubai or UAE, Dubai being the most common portion of UAE. You could look at Portugal. You could look at possibly Germany. You could look at Cyprus. Maybe you could look at some of these Latin American places like, one of the Caribbean islands or whatever. There's a few in there. Those are some. If you're not doing that, if you're saying, okay, I'm going to be trading, well, if you're going to be trading, then you usually want to be in some place like UAE or someplace like Cyprus. You can do Thailand with some structuring, okay? So Thailand is not good for crypto in general, but the way that Thailand's rules work, you can have a foreign company fairly easily and get away with that and then benefit from it accordingly. So that's not a bad option. Then you say, okay, well, what if I'm doing some sort of like a development or company or something? Again, UAE can't go wrong because it's zero tax. Usually if you're talking about something like a development company, it can sometimes make sense to use an entity like Estonia. Depends a little bit where you are, but this comes to how you can use a jurisdiction like, for instance, Estonia would work well with Portugal. Estonia would work well with, well, to some extent with Portugal. It's a little bit more of a complicated conversation. To some extent, it could work well with Cyprus. So you have some of those things. Other places that might be interesting, Germany's long-term hold rules could be useful. So if, say, you were founding a company and you were going to have tokens from the founding, that could be worthwhile because now you hold them for 12 months and you can sell, and the token value, if your cost basis is 0 on those, can be huge, right? That could be massively up, great returns, non-taxable. So that's useful to consider. There are some trickinesses around being able to take advantage of something like a non-dom program in UK or Ireland. That's possible to go to those places, but there's some trickiness around it. And of course, you can't stay there, okay? So all of this to say, in my view, the top place if you're going to do crypto today as a crypto business, right? So you're not just doing a long-term buy and hold, is probably UAE. It's probably the best place to choose as a residence. This being said, be aware that, there's no one size fits all. It's true that you can go with all kinds of different options depending on your individual circumstances. What is it that you like? Where do you need staff? What's the nature of your project? What weather matters to you? What other laws are important, etc. And so these could lead you to any of the other places that I've mentioned. That's usually a pretty good short list, although in practice we could expand it with a few more, but that was usually a pretty good short list. So I hope that helps. I hope it gives you a little bit of context, a bit of an idea. Some people might ask about, and have asked in a few cases, about my thoughts on Andorra. I'll do some videos specifically on Andorra. Andorra is a little bit slow on a bunch of things, a little bit expensive, a little bit bureaucratic, but they have a reasonable tax regime. So do some of the other Eastern European places like Bulgaria, like Georgia, etc. And so those can also be okay. But when I'm looking at what's the best, I'm trying to see it holistically. And holistically, I want to say, okay, it's fairly easy to move there. The tax treatment is good. The kind of business-friendly environment is good. I'm going to be in a situation where I can take advantage of reasonable infrastructure, and I might actually want to live there. Now, some people want to live in, wherever, right? So it's not to say that this is not the case for, look, a bunch of people have been going to Andorra. Personally, I find Andorra really small. Wouldn't personally want to live in Andorra, but some people like it, right? Georgia, some people really like Georgia, Some people really like, some Malta, right? It's not common. Most people don't like Malta as a place to live for a long term, but there's some who do. And so you have to pick what works for you, and any of these could be options. But if I was to say, if I had to pick one place, if you're like, okay, Michael, we're pressuring you, you have to pick one place, what's the best place to start a crypto business? And by this, we're not talking about issuing a token, because for issuing a token, UAE is not good. Okay, don't issue your token out of UAE. But if you're talking about like an active business, you being there, you're actually doing something involved in crypto, I would say the best residency is probably UAE for most people. So, or at least for the most variety of circumstances. Okay, so anyway, I hope that helps. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below, and I'm going to look forward to seeing you guys on the next video.